James Mitchell had always been fascinated by military history. At 32 years old, he worked as a construction foreman in Manchester, spending his weekdays managing building projects and his weekends visiting historical sites across England. His small apartment was filled with books about British military campaigns, model soldiers, and framed photographs from his visits to castles and battlefields. James wasn't a troublemaker. His co-workers knew him as reliable and hard-working. His neighbors described him as quiet and polite. He had no criminal record, no history of violence, and no reason to hate the royal family. In fact, he considered himself a patriot who respected British traditions and institutions. The problems in James's life were ordinary ones. His girlfriend Sarah had recently broken up with him after 3 years together, citing his obsession with military history and his inability to commit to their relationship. His mother had been diagnosed with early-stage cancer, requiring expensive treatments that strained the family's finances. His job at the construction company was under threat due to economic downturns affecting the building industry. These stresses had been building for months. James found himself drinking more than usual, staying up late reading military forums online, and becoming increasingly isolated from his friends and family. He had started taking longer walks through London during his weekends, often ending up at historical sites where he could escape from his problems for a few hours. On the morning of March 15, James woke up in his small hotel room near Russell Square feeling particularly low. He had come to London for what was supposed to be a job interview with a larger construction firm, but the meeting had been cancelled at the last minute. Now he was stuck in an expensive city with nowhere to go and nothing to do except wait for his train back to Manchester the next morning. After a quick breakfast at a nearby cafe, James decided to take another of his long walks. He had visited Buckingham Palace many times before, always admiring the precision of the guards and the grandeur of the building. Today felt different, though. The grey March sky matched his mood, and the crowds of tourists seemed more annoying than usual. As he walked through St. James's Park, James found himself thinking about his failed relationship, his mother's illness, and his uncertain future. The military history that usually brought him comfort now felt like a reminder of all the things he would never accomplish. He had dreamed of joining the army as a young man but had been rejected due to a minor hearing problem in his left ear. Instead of serving his country, he was building shopping centers and office blocks. By the time James reached Buckingham Palace, his mood had darkened considerably. The usual crowds of tourists were taking photographs and chattering excitedly about the possibility of seeing a member of the royal family. Street performers entertained children while parents bought overpriced souvenirs from nearby shops. Everything seemed fake and commercialized to James, a far cry from the serious military traditions he respected. He stopped near the main gates, watching the guards standing at attention in their red tunics and tall black hats. These were real soldiers, he knew, not just ceremonial figures. They carried loaded rifles and had the authority to use them if necessary. Their discipline impressed him, but it also made him feel inadequate. Here were men who had achieved what he never could, they served the crown with honor and distinction. James noticed one guard in particular, a young man who couldn't have been much older than 25. The guard stood perfectly still despite the chaos around him, his rifle held in the proper position, his eyes focused straight ahead. Tourists approached him constantly, trying to make him laugh or break his concentration, but the guard remained professional and composed. Something about this guard's youth bothered James. How had someone so young earned the right to wear that uniform and carry that weapon? What made him more deserving than James, who had studied military history for years and could probably recite more battle dates than the guard himself? These thoughts swirled in James's mind as he stood among the crowd for nearly an hour. He watched other tourists take photographs with the guards, saw children trying to make them smile, observed the constant stream of people treating these soldiers like entertainment rather than protectors of the monarchy. A group of American tourists near James were being particularly loud and disrespectful, making jokes about the guards' uniforms and wondering aloud whether their weapons were real. One of them, a middle-aged man with a camera hanging around his neck, approached the young guard James had been watching and began making silly faces, trying to get a reaction. The guard maintained his composure, but James felt his anger rising. These tourists had no understanding of military tradition or the sacrifice required to earn the right to stand guard at Buckingham Palace. They treated the whole thing like a theme park attraction, not recognizing the serious responsibility these men carried. James found himself walking closer to the guard. He told himself he just wanted to get a better look at the uniform and equipment, to appreciate the details that the tourists missed. The guard's rifle was a SA-80A2, a weapon James recognized from his reading about modern British military equipment. The bayonet mount was clearly visible, and the weapon was obviously loaded and ready for use. As James moved closer, he began to notice other things about the guard's equipment. The radio attached to his belt, the emergency whistle on a cord, the perfectly polished boots and brass buttons. Everything was regulation and proper, exactly as it should be for someone charged with protecting the royal family. But, the more James observed, the more his resentment grew. This young man had everything James wanted: purpose, respect, tradition, and the authority that came with serving the crown. Meanwhile, James was just another failed civilian watching from the sidelines, unable to participate in something greater than himself. The crowd around the guard was getting larger and more boisterous. Someone's child had dropped an ice cream cone near the guard's feet, and the sticky mess was attracting wasps. A street performer had set up nearby and was playing loud music that echoed off the palace walls. The whole scene was becoming chaotic and undignified. James looked at his watch and realized he had been standing there for over 2 hours. His train back to Manchester wasn't until tomorrow afternoon, which meant another long evening alone in his hotel room with nothing but his failures for company. The thought of returning to his empty life, his uncertain job prospects, and his sick mother filled him with despair. He glanced back at the young guard, still standing perfectly still despite the chaos around him. In that moment, James made a decision that would change his life forever. He wasn't sure exactly what he was planning to do, but he knew he was tired of being powerless, tired of being ignored, tired of being nothing more than a tourist watching real men do important work. James began to walk directly toward the guard, his heart pounding and his mind racing. The crowd of tourists seemed to part around him as he moved forward with purpose. The guard's eyes remained fixed straight ahead, but James could see the slight tension in his posture that suggested he was aware of the approaching figure. What happened next would be captured by dozens of tourist cameras and security footage, analyzed by police investigators and legal experts, and remembered by James Mitchell for the rest of his life as the moment everything went wrong. As James approached the guard, time seemed to slow down. Each step felt deliberate and heavy, as if he was walking through thick mud. The noise from the crowd faded to a dull background hum, and his focus narrowed to just the young soldier standing motionless in front of him. The guard's name was Lance Corporal Thomas Harrison, though James would only learn this much later. Harrison had been serving with the Coldstream Guards for 3 years and had been on ceremonial duty at Buckingham Palace for the past 6 months. At 24 years old, he had already completed a tour of duty in Afghanistan and earned commendations for his service under fire. To James, though, he was just a symbol of everything he himself could never be. Harrison noticed the man approaching from his peripheral vision but maintained his discipline. Tourists approached guards constantly throughout the day, and the proper protocol was to remain motionless unless there was a clear and immediate threat. Most people just wanted photographs or were trying to get a reaction. This man seemed different, though. There was an intensity to his movement that put Harrison on alert. James was now less than 3 feet from the guard. Up close, he could see the fine details of the uniform, the precision of the brass buttons, the way the rifle was held in exactly the correct position. The weapon itself was beautiful in its functionality, a tool of protection and authority that represented everything James felt he lacked in his own life. The moment of decision came suddenly. James later claimed he didn't plan what happened next, that it was an impulse driven by months of frustration and despair. One moment he was admiring the guard's equipment, and the next his hands were reaching toward the rifle. The SA-80A2 assault rifle was held in the order arms position, with the butt on the ground and Harrison's hands maintaining control of the weapon. When James's fingers made contact with the barrel, Harrison immediately felt the unauthorized touch through his grip on the stock. Military training kicked in instantly. "Step back immediately," Harrison commanded in a sharp, authoritative voice that cut through the ambient noise of the crowd. This was the first protocol when someone made unauthorized contact with a guard's weapon, a clear verbal warning that established the seriousness of the situation. But James was beyond listening to warnings. The feel of the rifle in his hands triggered something deep inside him, a desperate need to hold on to this symbol of authority and purpose even for just a moment. Instead of stepping back, he tried to pull the weapon away from the guard. Harrison's response was immediate and professional. With his right hand still firmly gripping the rifle, he used his left to trigger the alarm on his radio while simultaneously calling out the code for an attempted weapon grab. Emergency at Gate 1. Civilian attempting to take weapon. Immediate assistance required. The tourists around them initially didn't understand what was happening. Many thought it was part of some kind of ceremony or demonstration. Cameras continued clicking as people tried to capture what they assumed was normal protocol. Only when Harrison's voice rose to a shout did the crowd begin to realize something was seriously wrong. "Release the weapon now. Step back," Harrison yelled, his training taking over completely. The rifle was designed to be retained by its operator, and Harrison used proper weapon retention techniques to maintain control while alerting other guards and police in the area. James found himself in a bizarre tug-of-war with one of the Queen's guards in front of Buckingham Palace. The rational part of his mind knew this was insane, that he had crossed a line from which there was no return. But the desperate, angry part of him that had been building for months wouldn't let go. For just this moment, he had some control, some power, some connection to the world he had always wanted to be part of. The struggle lasted only about 15 seconds, but those seconds seemed eternal to both men involved. Harrison was stronger and better trained, but he was also constrained by protocols that prevented him from using excessive force unless his life was clearly in danger. James was driven by desperation and adrenaline, but he was also fighting against a professional soldier who knew exactly how to retain his weapon. Other guards and police officers were already responding to Harrison's radio call. The palace security system was designed for exactly this type of incident, with multiple layers of response that could be activated within seconds. Armed police from the Palace of Westminster, additional guards from other posts, and plainclothes protection officers all began converging on the scene. The crowd of tourists was now backing away as they realized this was not a normal part of the changing of the guard ceremony. Parents grabbed their children and moved toward the street, while others stood transfixed, continuing to record the incident on their phones. The casual, festive atmosphere around the palace gates had suddenly turned tense and dangerous. James could hear shouting from multiple directions now, but the words seemed muffled and distant. His entire world had narrowed to the struggle for control of the rifle. In his desperation, he managed to get both hands on the weapon and actually succeeded in pulling it away from Harrison's right hand, though the guard maintained his grip with his left. This escalation triggered the next level of security response. Harrison drew his sidearm with his free hand while continuing to fight for control of the rifle with the other. The sight of a second weapon being drawn caused screams from the remaining tourists and sent everyone running for cover. Armed police. Drop the weapon now. Multiple voices were shouting commands at James from different directions as officers surrounded the struggle. Red laser dots from police marksman rifles were now dancing across James's chest and head, though he was too focused on the rifle to notice. The end of the struggle came suddenly, when Harrison executed a weapon retention move that twisted the rifle away from James's grip while simultaneously stepping back to create distance. James stumbled forward, his hands now empty but, still reaching toward the weapon. That's when the armed police officers moved in. Four officers in tactical gear surrounded James, their weapons trained on him as they shouted conflicting commands. Get on the ground. Put your hands up. Don't move. Lie down now. The confusion of multiple officers giving different orders in high-stress situations is a common problem in police responses, and, James, still in shock from what he had just done, couldn't process what they wanted him to do. He stood there, swaying slightly, his hands raised but, not moving to the ground. One officer interpreted his failure to immediately comply as continued resistance. Within seconds, James found himself face down on the pavement with his arms twisted behind his back and, multiple knees pressing into his spine. The cold metal of handcuffs clicked around his wrists as officers continued to shout at him to stop resisting, even though he was no longer moving. The entire incident from first contact with the rifle to final arrest had lasted less than 2 minutes. But, those 2 minutes had created enough footage for dozens of news reports, initiated a major security investigation, and destroyed James Mitchell's life in ways he was only beginning to understand. As he lay on the ground with his face pressed against the cold pavement, James could hear the sound of sirens approaching and the excited chatter of tourists who had witnessed something they would tell their friends about for years. He could smell the exhaust from the city buses and feel the weight of the officers holding him down. For the first time since approaching the guard, James began to understand the magnitude of what he had just done. This wasn't a moment of military glory or a chance to be part of something important. This was a serious crime against the Crown, an attack on one of Britain's most protected institutions, and a violation of laws that carried severe penalties. Lance Corporal Harrison was already being debriefed by senior officers while medical personnel checked him for injuries. The rifle was being examined for damage and logged as evidence. The entire area around the palace gates was being cleared and secured while investigators began the process of documenting every aspect of the incident. James Mitchell, construction foreman from Manchester, had just committed one of the most serious security breaches in recent Buckingham Palace history. And his ordeal was just beginning. The back of the police van was cramped and uncomfortable, with hard plastic seats and no windows except for a small reinforced glass panel in the door. James sat in silence, his wrists still cuffed behind his back, feeling every bump and turn as the vehicle navigated through London traffic. The reality of what had happened was slowly sinking in, replacing the adrenaline-fueled confusion with a cold, sick feeling in his stomach. The journey to the police station took 20 minutes, but it felt like hours. James tried to replay the incident in his mind, searching for some explanation that would make sense of his actions. How had he gone from being a tourist admiring the guards to being arrested for attacking one? The transition seemed impossible, like a dream that had turned into a nightmare without warning. At Belgravia police station, James was processed with the efficiency of a system that dealt with serious crimes every day. His fingerprints were taken, photographs were captured from multiple angles, and his personal belongings were catalogued and stored. The custody sergeant, a veteran officer named David Reynolds, had seen thousands of arrestees over his 20-year career, but cases involving threats to the royal family always carried extra weight. James Michael Mitchell, Reynolds read from the booking form, "You are being held under Section 1 of the Prevention of Crime Act 1953 for the attempted theft of a firearm, Section 2 of the Firearms Act 1968 for unauthorized possession of a firearm, and Section 16 of the Public Order Act 1986 for threatening behavior. Additionally, we are investigating potential charges under the Treason Act 1842 for assault against a person in the immediate service of the Crown." The mention of treason hit James like a physical blow. He had studied enough British history to understand that treason was one of the most serious charges in the legal system, carrying penalties that could include life imprisonment. What he had thought was a moment of desperation was being treated as an attack on the monarchy itself. The duty solicitor assigned to James's case was Maria Santos, an experienced criminal defense lawyer who specialized in serious offenses. When she first met with James in the interview room, she immediately recognized the signs of someone who had made a catastrophic mistake without understanding the full implications of their actions. "Mr. Mitchell," she began, opening her notepad on the small metal table between them, "I need you to understand the severity of the situation you're facing. Attempting to take a weapon from a member of the Queen's Guard is not viewed by the courts as a simple assault or theft. It's seen as a direct threat to the security of the royal family and the stability of the crown." James stared at his hands, still marked with red lines from the handcuffs. "I didn't mean to threaten anyone," he said quietly. I don't know what I was thinking. Everything has been going wrong in my life, and, when I saw that guard standing there so perfectly, I just lost control for a moment." Santos had heard similar explanations before, but she knew that the courts would not be sympathetic to personal problems when it came to threats against royal security. "The prosecution will argue that your intentions don't matter," she explained. "What matters is that you made physical contact with a loaded weapon in the hands of a royal guard. From their perspective, you could have been a terrorist, an assassin, or someone planning to use that weapon against members of the royal family." The interview with police investigators began 3 hours after James's arrest. Detective Chief Inspector William Thompson was leading the investigation, supported by officers from the Metropolitan Police's Counterterrorism Command. The presence of counterterrorism investigators showed how seriously the authorities were taking the incident. Thompson was a methodical investigator who had spent 15 years working on cases involving threats to public figures and national security. He approached the interview with James as he would any potential terrorist incident, looking for evidence of planning, accomplices, or broader conspiracies against the crown. "Tell me about your activities in the days leading up to the incident," Thompson began, his voice professionally neutral. "Where you stayed in London, who you met with, what websites you visited, what your travel patterns were." James explained about the cancelled job interview, his solitary walks around London, his long-standing interest in military history. To him, these seemed like innocent activities, but Thompson was listening for signs of reconnaissance, planning, or radicalization that might indicate a more serious threat. The detective's questions became more pointed as the interview continued. "You spent considerable time watching the guards before approaching Corporal Harrison. Can you explain what you were observing? Were you studying their routines, their response procedures, their equipment?" "I was just interested in the history," James protested. "I've always been fascinated by military traditions. I wasn't planning anything specific. It was just an impulse." Thompson exchanged glances with his colleague, Detective Sergeant Claire Morrison. Claims of impulse were common in these types of cases, but they had to investigate the possibility that James had been conducting surveillance for a more serious attack. The fact that he had specifically targeted a young guard's weapon rather than simply trying to get attention suggested some level of intentionality. The investigation expanded rapidly beyond the interview room. James's hotel room was thoroughly searched by forensics experts looking for evidence of planning, terrorist materials, or connections to extremist groups. His laptop and mobile phone were seized and sent to digital forensics specialists who would examine every file, every internet search, every communication for signs of criminal intent. Meanwhile, security footage from across London was being reviewed to trace James's movements over the previous days. Cameras from the underground system, street surveillance networks, and tourist attractions created a detailed timeline of his activities leading up to the incident. Investigators were particularly interested in whether he had conducted reconnaissance of other royal sites or government buildings. James's background was subjected to intensive scrutiny. His employment history, financial records, medical records, and social media accounts were all examined for red flags. Investigators interviewed his former colleagues, neighbors, and acquaintances, looking for signs of radicalization, mental instability, or connections to anti-monarchist groups. The investigation revealed a man who was struggling with personal problems but showed no signs of political extremism or terrorist connections. James's internet search history showed extensive research into military history and British royal traditions, but nothing that suggested planning for an attack. His financial records indicated money problems but no suspicious transactions or payments from unknown sources. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the forensic psychiatrist assigned to evaluate James's mental state, found evidence of depression and stress-related anxiety but no signs of serious mental illness that would affect his understanding of right and wrong. Mr. Mitchell appears to have been going through a difficult period in his personal life, she wrote in her report, but he demonstrates clear understanding of his actions and their consequences. While the investigation continued, James remained in custody at Belgravia police station. The seriousness of the charges meant that bail would be extremely difficult to obtain, especially given the involvement of royal security. He spent his days in a small cell, eating prison meals and trying to understand how his life had changed so dramatically in such a short time. The media attention surrounding the case was intense. News reports described the incident as a shocking security breach and a terrifying assault on royal protection. Tabloid newspapers ran headlines like "Tourist Terror at Palace" and "Madman Attacks Queen's Guard." James's photograph, taken from his social media accounts, appeared on front pages across the country. The coverage was universally negative, painting James as either a dangerous extremist or a mentally unstable individual who had put the royal family at risk. No one seemed interested in his personal struggles or the factors that had led to his moment of poor judgment. He had become a symbol of the threats facing the monarchy in an increasingly dangerous world. Back in Manchester, James's mother Linda watched the news coverage with growing horror and disbelief. Her son, who had always been interested in supporting British traditions, was being portrayed as a terrorist who had tried to attack the Queen. The stress of the situation, combined with her ongoing cancer treatment, left her devastated and confused. James's former girlfriend Sarah was contacted by journalists seeking information about his character and possible motives. She told them that he was obsessed with military history but never violent, but these nuanced comments were edited down to soundbites that made him seem unstable and potentially dangerous. As the investigation entered its second week, it became clear that the evidence supported the charges against James. Video footage clearly showed him grabbing the guard's rifle, witness statements confirmed the sequence of events, and forensic evidence from the weapon showed his fingerprints on the barrel. The question was no longer whether he had committed the alleged crimes, but what his punishment would be. The Crown Prosecution Service, working with counter-terrorism specialists, decided to proceed with the most serious charges available. The attempted theft of a firearm, assault against a Crown servant, and potential treason charges carried sentences that could total decades in prison. James Mitchell, who had been a free man just 2 weeks earlier, was facing the possibility of spending the rest of his productive life behind bars. The weight of the British legal system, with its centuries of protecting the Crown and punishing those who threatened royal authority, was now focused entirely on destroying him. The Old Bailey, formerly known as the Central Criminal Court, had witnessed some of the most significant trials in British legal history. As James Mitchell was led into court number 1 in handcuffs and prison clothes, he joined a long list of defendants who had faced the full weight of British justice within these historic walls. The ornate courtroom, with its high ceiling and wooden galleries, seemed designed to emphasize the power and authority of the legal system compared to the vulnerability of those who stood accused. Judge Sir Martin Whitfield, a veteran of 30 years on the bench, presided over the case with the gravity it demanded. Cases involving threats to the royal family were among the most serious that appeared before his court, and he was acutely aware that the outcome would be scrutinized by legal experts, security services, and the media. The message sent by James's sentence would influence how future threats to royal security were handled. The prosecution team, led by Queen's Counsel Catherine Burke, had built their case around the argument that James's actions represented a serious threat to national security and the stability of the constitutional monarchy. Burke was known for her aggressive prosecution style and her ability to present complex legal arguments in terms that juries could easily understand. Members of the jury, Burke began in her opening statement, the defendant's actions on March 15 were not the result of a momentary lapse in judgment, as the defense would have you believe. They were a deliberate assault on the institutions that protect our sovereign and maintain the security of our nation. When Mr. Mitchell put his hands on that rifle, he crossed a line that has protected the royal family for centuries. Burke's presentation included video footage from multiple angles showing James approaching the guard, grabbing the rifle, and struggling to take control of the weapon. The footage was damning, clearly showing that James had initiated the contact and continued to fight for the weapon even after being ordered to release it. Lance Corporal Harrison gave testimony about the incident that was professional and restrained, but devastating to James's case. The defendant grabbed my rifle and attempted to pull it away from me, Harrison testified. I followed proper protocols for weapon retention and called for assistance. At no point did the defendant indicate that his contact with my weapon was accidental or unintentional. Under cross-examination by James's defense barrister, Harrison acknowledged that James had not made any verbal threats or shown any other weapons. However, Burke's re-examination emphasized that someone attempting to take a loaded rifle from a royal guard didn't need to make verbal threats, their actions spoke for themselves. The defense strategy, developed by Maria Santos and barrister Richard Pemberton, focused on James's mental state and personal circumstances at the time of the incident. They argued that while James's actions were clearly wrong, they were the result of depression, stress, and poor judgment rather than any intention to threaten the royal family or commit a terrorist act. Dr. Susan Crawford, a forensic psychiatrist called as a defense witness, testified about James's mental condition at the time of the offense. Mr. Mitchell was suffering from significant depression related to relationship breakdown, family illness, and employment uncertainty, she explained. While this does not excuse his actions, it provides important context for understanding why someone with no previous history of violence might act so out of character. Pemberton's defense was hampered by the clear video evidence and the seriousness of the charges. British law provides limited sympathy for defendants who threaten royal security, regardless of their personal circumstances. The legal precedents from similar cases suggested that James would face significant prison time unless extraordinary mitigating factors could be established. James himself testified on his own behalf, a risky strategy that exposed him to aggressive cross-examination by the prosecution. He attempted to explain his actions as a moment of madness brought on by months of accumulated stress and disappointment. "I never intended to hurt anyone," James said, his voice barely audible in the large courtroom. "I've always respected the monarchy and the military. I don't know why I did what I did. It was like watching someone else's hands reach for that rifle. I knew it was wrong even as I was doing it, but I couldn't seem to stop myself." Burke's cross-examination was merciless, focusing on the premeditation suggested by James's long observation of the guards before the incident. "You spent over an hour watching the guards before you approached Corporal Harrison, didn't you, Mr. Mitchell? That suggests careful planning rather than a momentary impulse." James struggled to explain his behavior in terms that the jury could understand. His description of feeling powerless and seeking some connection to military tradition sounded weak and unconvincing when contrasted with the serious security breach he had caused. The prosecution also called expert witnesses on royal security to explain the broader implications of James's actions. Commander Robert Stevens from the Metropolitan Police Protection Command testified about the careful security arrangements that protect the royal family and how even seemingly minor breaches could compromise the safety of the monarchy. "Every aspect of royal protection is carefully planned and tested," Stevens explained. "When someone attempts to take a weapon from a protection officer, it creates a cascade of security concerns. Other officers must respond, resources must be diverted, and the entire protective envelope around the royal family is compromised." The trial lasted 8 days, with extensive media coverage that consistently portrayed James as either a dangerous fanatic or a pathetic failure who had destroyed his own life through a moment of stupidity. Public opinion, as reflected in newspaper editorials and social media comments, was overwhelmingly against him. Many commenters argued that anyone who threatened royal security deserved whatever punishment the courts imposed. James's mother Linda attended every day of the trial despite her ongoing cancer treatment, sitting in the public gallery and watching her son's life be dissected by lawyers and experts. The stress of the proceedings was clearly affecting her health, but she refused to abandon James during his ordeal. The jury deliberated for 6 hours before returning their verdict. On the charge of attempted theft of a firearm, they found James guilty. On the charge of assault against a crown servant, they found him guilty. On the more serious charge of conduct likely to breach the peace in relation to royal security, they found him guilty. Judge Whitfield's sentencing remarks reflected the gravity with which British courts view threats to royal security. Mr. Mitchell, your actions on March 15 represent a serious breach of the protections that safeguard our constitutional monarchy. While I accept that you were experiencing personal difficulties at the time, this cannot excuse or significantly mitigate your deliberate attempt to take a loaded weapon from one of Her Majesty's guards. The sentence was devastating: 7 years imprisonment, with a minimum of 4 years to be served before the possibility of parole. Additionally, James was banned from approaching within 500 meters of any royal residence or ceremonial site for the rest of his life. The judge also imposed a serious violence prevention order that would subject him to police monitoring for 5 years after his release. As James was led away to begin his sentence, the reality of what he had lost hit him fully for the first time. His construction career was over. No employer would hire someone with convictions for violent offenses against the crown. His relationship with his mother would be conducted through prison visits and phone calls for the next several years. His dreams of military service or any connection to the traditions he had once admired were permanently destroyed. The media coverage of the sentencing was extensive, with most outlets describing it as appropriate punishment for a serious threat to royal security. Legal experts interviewed by news programs praised the sentence as sending a clear message that threats to the monarchy would be met with severe consequences. James was initially sent to HMP Belmarsh, a high-security prison in southeast London that housed terrorism suspects and other inmates considered dangerous to national security. The classification reflected the authorities' view of his offense as more than simple criminal behavior. It was seen as a form of political violence that threatened the stability of the state. The prison environment was harsh and unforgiving. James was housed in a wing with other inmates convicted of terrorism-related offenses, making him a target for both prison guards who viewed him as a threat and other prisoners who saw him as either a political extremist or a mentally unstable individual who didn't belong in their community. His daily routine consisted of 23 hours locked in a small cell with basic amenities and 1 hour of exercise in a concrete yard surrounded by high walls and razor wire. Contact with the outside world was limited to supervised phone calls twice a week and monthly visits from approved family members. James's mother Linda managed to visit him once a month despite her deteriorating health, traveling by train from Manchester to London and enduring intensive security screening to spend 1 hour with her son in a sterile visiting room. These visits were emotionally devastating for both of them, as they watched each other decline, James from the stress of prison life and Linda from the combination of cancer treatment and the trauma of seeing her son imprisoned. The psychological impact of his situation began to affect James severely within the first few months of his sentence. The sudden transition from freedom to high-security imprisonment, combined with the knowledge that his actions had destroyed not only his own life but also affected his mother's health, led to episodes of severe depression and anxiety. Dr. Michael Thompson, the prison psychiatrist assigned to James's case, diagnosed him with adjustment disorder with depressive and anxious features. Mr. Mitchell is struggling to cope with the consequences of his actions and the reality of long-term imprisonment, Thompson noted in his medical records. He shows signs of genuine remorse but also exhibits symptoms of severe depression that require ongoing monitoring. James's case became a point of reference for security experts and legal scholars studying threats to royal protection. Academic papers analyzing the incident focused on the balance between maintaining public access to royal sites and ensuring adequate security against potential threats. His case was cited in training materials for royal protection officers as an example of how quickly a seemingly harmless tourist interaction could escalate into a serious security incident. The broader impact of James's actions extended far beyond his personal punishment. Security procedures at Buckingham Palace and other royal sites were reviewed and strengthened in response to the incident. The number of armed officers visible to the public was increased, and new barriers were installed to maintain greater distance between tourists and guards. The cost of these enhanced security measures was estimated in the hundreds of thousands of pounds. As James served his sentence, the world outside continued to move forward without him. His former colleagues found new jobs, his friends gradually stopped mentioning him in conversations, and his small apartment in Manchester was cleared out and rented to someone else. The construction projects he had been working on were completed by other foremen, and the military history books he had collected were donated to charity shops. The man who had dreamed of being part of military tradition had instead become a cautionary tale about the consequences of threatening the institutions he had once admired. His moment of poor judgment had created ripple effects that would continue long after his release from prison, affecting not only his own future but also the security arrangements that protect the British royal family. 3.5 years into his sentence, James Mitchell had become a different person from the man who had impulsively grabbed a royal guard's rifle at Buckingham Palace. The harsh realities of prison life, combined with intensive psychological treatment and the devastating loss of his mother to cancer 18 months earlier, had forced him to confront the deep-seated issues that had led to his catastrophic mistake. The news of Linda Mitchell's death had reached James through a phone call from his cousin Sarah, delivered in the sterile atmosphere of the prison's communication room. The cancer that had been slowly weakening her when James was arrested had accelerated under the stress of his imprisonment and the social stigma that came with having a son convicted of threatening the crown. She had died alone in a Manchester hospice, asking the nurses until her final moments when her son would be able to come home. James was permitted to attend his mother's funeral under heavy police escort, wearing handcuffs and leg shackles throughout the service. The small congregation consisted mainly of distant relatives and a few of Linda's elderly neighbors, most of whom avoided eye contact with James. The priest spoke kindly about Linda's devotion to her son despite his troubles, but even this gentle reference to his crimes felt like another weight added to the burden of guilt James carried every day. The grief counseling sessions that followed his mother's death marked a turning point in James's psychological treatment. Dr. Rachel Harrison, a specialist in trauma therapy who had been working with James for over a year, finally began to see breakthrough moments where he could honestly confront the complex emotions that had driven his actions. "I think I was angry at everyone who had what I couldn't have," James admitted during one particularly difficult session. "The guard represented everything I thought I deserved but never achieved. Military service, respect, purpose, tradition. When I saw him standing there so perfectly, I didn't see a person doing his job. I saw everything that was wrong with my own life." Dr. Harrison helped James understand that his actions were not just a momentary lapse in judgment but the culmination of years of accumulated resentment, depression, and misplaced anger. The military fantasies that had sustained him through his civilian disappointments had become toxic when confronted with the reality of actual military service that he could never be part of. The prison's education department offered James the opportunity to complete a bachelor's degree in history through correspondence courses with the Open University. Initially, he was reluctant to engage with academic study, viewing it as pointless given his criminal record and uncertain future. However, the structure and intellectual challenge eventually provided him with a healthy outlet for his interests that didn't involve dangerous fantasies about military glory. His dissertation focused on the psychological impact of military service on civilian society, examining how the gap between civilian and military experiences affects veterans' reintegration and civilians' understanding of military life. The research forced him to confront his own romanticized views of military service and understand the complex realities faced by actual soldiers returning from combat. Professor Margaret Edwards, who supervised James's degree work, later wrote, "Mr. Mitchell's academic work demonstrated genuine insight into the psychological factors that contribute to civilian-military tensions. His personal experience, while tragic in its consequences, provided him with a unique perspective on the dangers of idealizing military service without understanding its realities." James's behavior in prison gradually improved as he engaged more seriously with education and therapy. He avoided the gang activities that dominated much of prison life, instead spending his time in the library, participating in group counseling sessions, and eventually becoming a mentor for newer inmates struggling with adjustment disorders. The prison chaplain, Father David O'Brien, became an important source of support for James as he struggled with guilt over his mother's death and fear about his future. O'Brien had worked with many inmates convicted of terrorism-related offenses and understood the particular challenges faced by those whose crimes carried political implications. James was carrying enormous guilt, Father O'Brien later reflected. Not just about his actions at the palace, but about the impact those actions had on his mother's final years. He felt responsible for her suffering and her death, which made his own rehabilitation much more difficult. Learning to forgive himself was essential to his recovery. The parole process began during James's 4th year of imprisonment. The parole board reviews for inmates convicted of offenses against royal security involved extensive psychological evaluations, risk assessments by counterterrorism experts, and detailed analysis of the prisoner's behavior and rehabilitation progress while incarcerated. Dr. Sarah Williams, the forensic psychiatrist who conducted James's pre-parole evaluation, found significant evidence of genuine rehabilitation and remorse. Mr. Mitchell has engaged seriously with psychological treatment and has developed insight into the factors that contributed to his offending behavior, she wrote in her report. He presents a low risk of reoffending and has demonstrated sustained behavioral change over a period of more than 2 years. However, the security services remained concerned about the precedent that might be set by releasing someone who had physically attacked royal protection. MI5 conducted its own assessment of James's case, interviewing prison staff, reviewing his correspondence and phone calls, and analyzing his educational work for signs of continued anti-establishment sentiment. The final parole hearing took place in a secure conference room at HMP Belmarsh, with James facing a panel of 3 experienced parole board members, including a retired judge, a forensic psychiatrist, and a former police chief superintendent. The atmosphere was formal and intimidating, with the panel's decision carrying the power to determine whether James would serve his full 7-year sentence or be released after 4.5 years. Panel chairman Sir Robert Davies questioned James extensively about his understanding of his offences and his plans for reintegration into society. Mr. Mitchell, you committed very serious offences that threatened the security of the Crown and required significant resources to investigate and prosecute. What assurance can you give this panel that you will not pose a similar risk in the future? James's response drew on years of therapy and self-reflection. I understand now that my actions weren't really about the guard or even about the royal family. They were about my own failures and disappointments that I hadn't dealt with properly. I had created a fantasy about military life that had nothing to do with reality, and, when that fantasy was challenged, I reacted in a completely inappropriate way. He continued, I've spent 4 years thinking about the harm I caused, not just to Corporal Harrison and the security services, but to my mother, to my family, and to the people who knew me before this happened. I can't undo what I did, but I can make sure it never happens again by continuing the work I've done to understand and manage my mental health. The parole panel also considered testimony from prison staff about James's behavior and progress. Governor Patricia Mills noted that Mr. Mitchell has been a model prisoner for the past 2 years, actively participating in educational programs and mentoring other inmates. He has shown no signs of the anger and resentment that characterized his early months in custody. Dr. Harrison provided detailed testimony about James's psychological progress, emphasizing his development of healthy coping mechanisms and realistic perspectives on his future. Mr. Mitchell has done the difficult work of confronting the underlying issues that led to his offending. He has realistic expectations about the challenges he will face upon release and has developed practical strategies for managing stress and disappointment. The decision to grant parole came with extensive conditions designed to monitor James's reintegration into society and prevent any future security risks. He would be required to live in approved accommodation, report regularly to a probation officer, submit to random drug and alcohol testing, and avoid all royal sites and ceremonial locations. Additionally, he would be prohibited from traveling abroad for 2 years and would be subject to electronic monitoring for his first year of release. Most significantly, James was banned for life from entering London except for pre-approved purposes such as medical appointments or legal proceedings. The exclusion from the capital city where he had committed his offence was intended to remove him from potential triggers and reduce any temptation to revisit the scene of his crime. James's release from HMP Belmarsh on a grey morning in October occurred without fanfare or media attention. The news cycle had long since moved on to other stories, and public interest in his case had faded. He was met at the prison gates by his probation officer, Susan Chen, who would be responsible for supervising his reintegration into society. The approved accommodation was a probation hostel in Leeds, chosen specifically because it was far from both his former life in Manchester and the scene of his offence in London. The hostel housed 12 men who were transitioning back into society after serving sentences for various offences, ranging from burglary to serious assault. James's first few weeks of freedom were overwhelming and disorienting. After years of highly structured prison routine, the simple decision of what to eat for breakfast or what time to go to bed felt complicated and stressful. The noise and bustle of normal city life, which he had once taken for granted, now seemed chaotic and unpredictable. Finding employment with his criminal record proved extremely difficult. The conviction for offences against royal security made him unemployable in any role that required security clearance or background checks. Construction companies were reluctant to hire someone with convictions for violent offences, even though his previous work record had been exemplary. After months of rejection and increasingly desperate applications, James finally found work with a small landscaping company run by David Palmer, a man who believed in second chances. Palmer had served his own prison sentence 20 years earlier for assault and understood the challenges facing ex-offenders trying to rebuild their lives. "I'm not hiring you because I think what you did was acceptable," Palmer told James during their first meeting. "I'm hiring you because everyone deserves the chance to prove they can change. But, if you bring any drama or problems to my business, you're gone immediately." The work was physically demanding but provided James with structure, purpose, and the opportunity to be outdoors rather than confined in institutional settings. He started as a general laborer, doing basic ground preparation and maintenance work, but gradually took on more responsibility as he proved himself reliable and hardworking. The psychological challenges of reintegration were as difficult as the practical ones. James struggled with anxiety in crowded places, particularly anywhere that reminded him of tourist attractions or government buildings. He attended weekly counseling sessions with Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a specialist in helping ex-offenders adjust to life after release. James was dealing with multiple layers of trauma, Dr. Walsh later explained. The original issues that led to his offense, the traumatic experience of imprisonment, the grief over his mother's death, and the stress of trying to rebuild his life with a serious criminal record. It's remarkable that he managed to maintain his stability during this period. James's social isolation was profound. His old friends from Manchester had moved on with their lives, and making new friendships was complicated by his inability to discuss significant periods of his recent past. Dating seemed impossible. How could he explain to someone why he had spent 4 years in prison without revealing the humiliating details of his offense? The electronic monitoring tag on his ankle served as a constant reminder of his status as someone who could not be fully trusted. The device monitored his location 24 hours a day, and any deviation from his approved schedule or movements outside permitted areas would trigger an immediate response from the probation service. 2 years after his release, James received permission to visit his mother's grave for the first time since her funeral. The journey to Manchester felt like traveling to a different world. The city where he had once lived and worked now seemed foreign and unwelcoming. The cemetery where Linda Mitchell was buried was small and well-maintained, with her simple headstone bearing only her name and dates. Standing at his mother's grave, James finally allowed himself to feel the full weight of what his actions had cost. Not just his own freedom and future, but her final years of peace and dignity. The woman who had raised him and supported his interests had died as the mother of a man convicted of threatening the crown, a designation that had brought shame and isolation to her final months. "I'm sorry, Mum," he said aloud to the headstone, his voice breaking with emotion. "I'm sorry for all of it. I'm trying to be better, but I know that doesn't change what happened to you because of what I did." The grief and guilt that James experienced at his mother's grave marked another turning point in his rehabilitation. With Dr. Walsh's help, he began to understand that meaningful redemption would require him to find ways to contribute positively to society rather than simply avoiding further offenses. James began volunteering with a local charity that worked with at-risk youth, sharing his story as a cautionary tale about the consequences of poor decision-making and untreated mental health issues. Speaking to teenagers about his experience was initially terrifying, but it gradually became a source of purpose and meaning in his reconstructed life. "I never tell them exactly what I did," James explained to Dr. Walsh during one of their sessions. "I just tell them that I made a mistake that destroyed my life and hurt everyone I cared about. I try to help them understand that no matter how bad things seem, there are always better options than doing something stupid and destructive." The youth outreach work led to other volunteer opportunities, including helping elderly residents with garden maintenance and participating in community cleanup projects. These activities provided James with a sense of contributing to something positive rather than simply existing as a burden on society. 5 years after his release, James had achieved a stability that had seemed impossible during his first months of freedom. He had been promoted to supervisor at the landscaping company, was living independently in a small flat, and had developed a circle of acquaintances who knew him as a reliable and thoughtful man rather than as the criminal from the newspaper headlines. However, the restrictions on his movement and the lifetime ban from royal sites meant that certain aspects of normal life remained closed to him forever. He could not visit London's tourist attractions, attend state ceremonies, or even take a casual walk past Buckingham Palace. The military history that had once fascinated him became too painful to pursue, as it reminded him of the delusions that had led to his downfall. The annual review meetings with his probation officer gradually became more positive as James demonstrated sustained rehabilitation and community integration. Susan Chen, who had supervised his case from the beginning, noted the remarkable transformation from the bitter and confused man who had left prison to the stable and contributing member of society he had become. James's case demonstrates both the severity of offenses against royal security and the possibility of genuine rehabilitation, Chen wrote in her final report. His journey has been long and difficult, but he has done the work necessary to rebuild his life in a positive way. As James approached the end of his formal supervision period, he reflected on the long journey from that moment of madness at Buckingham Palace to his current life of quiet redemption. He would never be able to completely escape the consequences of his actions, the criminal record, the restrictions on his movement, and the lost opportunities would remain with him forever. But he had learned to find meaning and purpose within those constraints, building a life that honored his mother's memory and contributed positively to his community. The man who had once dreamed of military glory had found a different kind of service, helping others avoid the mistakes that had nearly destroyed him. The Royal Guard whose rifle he had grabbed, Lance Corporal Thomas Harrison, had continued his military career and eventually left the army to become a police officer. The incident that had ruined James's life had been just another day at work for Harrison, a reminder of the gap between those who serve with honor and those who can only dream of such service. James Mitchell's story became a case study in the criminal justice system's approach to offenses against royal security, the challenges of rehabilitation after serious crimes, and the long-term consequences of momentary lapses in judgment. It served as both a cautionary tale about the severe penalties for threatening the crown and evidence that even those who commit such serious offenses can find paths to redemption and meaningful contribution to society. The man who had once grabbed for a symbol of authority he could never possess had learned to find authority over his own life, building something worthwhile from the ruins of his catastrophic mistake. It was not the life he had once imagined for himself, but it was a life he could live with dignity and purpose, forever mindful of how quickly everything can change with a single, irreversible decision. In the heart of London, where centuries of royal tradition meet the chaos of modern life, a single moment of madness can destroy a person's entire future. Buckingham Palace stands as more than just a building, it's a symbol of power, history, and untouchable authority. The red-coated guards who stand motionless at its gates aren't just for show. They're highly trained soldiers with real weapons, real authority, and zero tolerance for threats. What happens when an ordinary person makes an extraordinary mistake? When someone crosses a line that should never be crossed? When the weight of royal security comes crashing down on one foolish decision? This is the true story of a man who thought he could grab a loaded rifle from a Queen's Guard at Buckingham Palace. What followed wasn't just an arrest, it was a cascade of consequences that would haunt him for the rest of his life. A moment that lasted seconds would create ripple effects lasting years. Some mistakes can be forgiven. Some can be forgotten. But, when you threaten the crown, when you put your hands on a royal guard's weapon, when you cross the most protected threshold in Britain, there's no going back. This is that story.